And these gaps matter because when experts and the public disagree about risks, people can end up doing something that actually puts them more at risk.
You are actually trying to find the silver lining in those numbers. That's what we are all trying to find.
For want of a better word, propaganda tool, political tool.
Data, information, whatever you want to call it, does nothing. It doesn't change anything, doesn't do anything.
We've kind of got a responsibility as academics to make sure that knowledge doesn't just stay inside the ivory tower.
We don't want to be saying, oh, isn't this an awful thing, we should be doing X. No. You don't immediately draw some consequence rule, because that's what really pisses me off.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Welcome to this latest end-of-season wrap-up for Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. We've now completed 5 seasons of the pod, and this greatest hits episode is the 36th that we've put out. Season 5 opened with a bang, and it was a pleasure and an honour to welcome one of the country's, nay the world's finest data storytellers, Sir David Spiegelhalter. David today is the Emeritus Professor of Statistics in the Department of Mathematics at the University of Cambridge, his home for the past 40 years. Technically, David has retired, but as he tells me, he hasn't really. It's nice not having a job, he says. I pick and choose to spend my time communicating stats and the ideas behind them. Until his formal retirement, David was the Winton Professor for Risk and Evidence Communication at Cambridge. Later this year, Pelican is publishing his latest book, titled The Art of Uncertainty: Living with Chance, Ignorance, Risk and Luck. Here's David talking about uncertainty, ignorance, and the impossibility of being objective.
My crucial thing about uncertainty is it's a relationship. You know, it has to have a subject. Someone has to be uncertain about something. It's got a subject and an object. Then, of course, it's got things like how do you express it? Do you put it into numbers? Why are you uncertain? A source, a context, and all that kind of stuff as well. But the crucial thing is that there's a relationship. It has to have a subject and an object. So the uncertainties will vary according to who it is who's saying this uncertainty. So once you've got that understanding, I think it does change one's perspective, because it means that there's a huge responsibility on behalf of the person who is making the claims to acknowledge just how much of them has gone into that.
I was originally a classicist, and when I'm advising companies on how to conduct and analyse and present research findings, I routinely introduce them to the Socratic paradox. As I know you'll know, many times in Plato's dialogues, Socrates begins his search for the essential essence of truth or beauty or justice or courage with a line, "All that I know is that I know nothing." Do you think it's important that we embrace, as I might put it, our inner Socrates when it comes to what we do and what we don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, uncertainties is a nice definition. It's a consciousness of ignorance, and I really like that. It's very difficult. I mean, this is something you have to practice of being ignorant. I always wanted to be. If I was rich, I'd a professor of ignorance. I think would be a great title to be something like that. No, ignorance is called agnotology, is sometimes called. But I think it's a really important issue, because we're just ignorant, and whether, as I said, I talk about it in my book, whether in fact what happens is all, actually predetermined, it's all just mechanical, universe, it's all the will of God, all this. Poof, I don't care. I don't even bother to argue about these issues. Couldn't care less, because the crucial thing is our personal ignorance about what's going to happen or what's going on, and trying to resolve that. So it's all to do with our personal relationship with the outside world and each other, and trying to be honest and trustworthy about our assessment of what's going on. And that means, first of all, I use the word humility a lot in now what I'm writing, because it's that humility to admit you don't know. And yet, just because you don't know everything doesn't mean you don't know anything. You also have to have the confidence to say what you do know. So, there's this nice sort of slightly paradoxical phrases we use. You've got to be confidently uncertain. So, proclaim your uncertainty and not back off it at all.
And not bring those biases and assumptions and prior knowledge and prejudices to the line of inquiry.
Well, you always bring prior knowledge, that's true. But one can, and absolutely right. And you can never be objective at all. No, we all bring our own our own feelings to whatever we do. It's reflexivity is the thing. We should try at least to be aware of what we're bringing in and acknowledge that this is our judgments, there's judgment involved, and try to ensure that those judgments are shared by many people. In other words, it's not just you going out on a limb and I think this way. Point is, you can still say that. It's absolutely fine. Why anyone should take any notice of you? Who knows? So if you want to be actually both true to yourself, but also actually kind of have someone take any notice of you, deserve attention, then what you say, should be grounded on a basis of argument, of good argument that many people agree with. So it's always best, of course, if you have a view that you can justify and that other people are signed up to. So you're not just a lone voice in the universe, because I'm deeply suspicious of those. But there's still judgment there. There's still it's not self-evident. Almost nothing is self-evident in this area.
Risk was a big theme for Season 5. Olivia Jensen is the Deputy Director and Lead Scientist at the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk, a Lloyd's Register foundation based out of the National University of Singapore. She told me about what the Institute has learned about how to communicate risk and uncertainty effectively. As you'll hear, it's all about giving people the information they actually need, and in timely fashion. She takes COVID as a case in point. Let's inevitably have a little look at COVID. What do you think that we've learned from the COVID years about how to communicate risk and uncertainty effectively?
I'm not quite sure how much we've learned. It seems to me that now that COVID's over, that in other domains, some of the lessons haven't quite translated. But let me talk a little bit about what I hope we've learned, perhaps. I think one point is to give people the information they need. So it needs to be timely. People are not in a position to wait for the cycle of kind of academic analysis. People were very thirsty for information much throughout the pandemic, and being able to provide that to them, on a website that got updated every day with the latest information, with in a format that they found that was just easy to read off. And then I think really importantly, that people were able to find themselves in the risk information. So I'm a woman of a certain age. I have an underlying health condition. What's the risk to me of a serious case of COVID, of hospitalization, of death? And what's the risk to me of taking the vaccination and different types of vaccinations? So being able to find yourself, your identity in the risk information, I think was very important to people. And I'm not sure that we see that in other domains now, whether it's possible for people faced with another kind of health risk to go and find that information that fits their profile. But I think that was something that did get done during COVID, and I hope that it could be replicated and sort of just become a standard thing. I think there was also recognition, at least in some places and some of the time, to sort of meet people where they were at, to understand the constraints that people faced, to understand maybe the sort of mental models, perhaps surrounding vaccination and the role of pharmaceutical companies and things, which lay behind some of their instinctive reactions, and still to communicate with them, to recognize that as maybe it wasn't something you agreed with, but to recognize that that was their starting point, and then to try to talk to them from there about what the sort of risks and benefits, both of the disease and also of the vaccinations were, or other protective actions like wearing a mask. So not just communicating to this sort of ideal member of the public who's like a clean slate and loves science and is happy to receive the whatever information you want to give them, but recognizing that people are not clean slates. People start with models and in some cases sort of preferences which are going to affect their responses, and thinking, okay, then it's my job as the risk communicator to work out how to nevertheless provide this person with useful information and something that they feel they can use. And then I think also in some places and at the best times, there was also recognition and some experience in communicating about uncertainty. So saying, here are some of the things we don't know yet. But given that we don't know, we're recommending this policy, or we're going to implement this restriction. And it may change, because right now we're collecting more information. It's very fast evolving, and it may change a couple of weeks down the line. We commit to constantly reviewing the information and constantly updating our policy. I mean, if only that had been kind of translated into the way that we handle lots of risks. And I don't really think that it has. But the idea that the scientists might commit to kind of regularly updating the scientific information, making that available to decision makers, and decision makers committing to regularly reviewing the scientific information, so we could be sure that whatever regulations, rules, laws, recommendations were in place really reflected the latest scientific understanding of, let's say, a health risk.
If anyone can be said to have had a good pandemic, it was certainly Sir David Spiegelhalter. Here's his considered perspective on what COVID taught us about communicating data to the public, both what to do and, tellingly, what not to do. What do you think that we've learned from the pandemic about how best and indeed how worst to present data to the general public?
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, I suppose I did have a good pandemic because I didn't get very ill, and I actually had something to do, even though I was stuck at home. I was sitting, turned the sort of front room into a mini studio, and performed and did a lot of work. I mean, the point is, data was coming in every day at 4:00 from the dashboard. Other data coming in every week, and I was doing the analyses. The ONS data used to come in at 9:30 on Tuesday morning. Well, I think we were doing press briefings by 11:00. So, that was the most incredibly intense time of doing all the analyses and getting the graphs done and things like that, and being ready to do briefings at the Science Media Centre on the data. So it's really quite exciting, since it's nice to have something to do. So we were busy, we were writing. We had Anthony Masters and I had a column in the Observer for 50 weeks. They gave us 350 words in the bottom of the middle of the paper on statistics, and we did one or two and thought, well, that's it, that's fine. And they said, well, carry on. We said, well, okay, we'll do a few more. Can we stop now? No, people like it. 50 of them we did, until we said, we're going to stop. We refused to do any more. And then they gave us a whole page. So that was a real challenge, really, against storytelling. 350 words, God, twice as difficult as 700 words in it, and without jargon, without maths, without graphs, and yet telling really quite subtle statistical stories about everything. And this stuff was popular. People were interested, and it felt quite a worthwhile thing to do. We'll get on to this, but one had, particularly in where you did have a lot of polarized points of view, trying not to be polarized, sort of sitting in the middle. But what have we learned? Oh God, about communication. Yeah, that done properly, there's a huge audience and market for communicating about stats, but when people are genuinely interested in it, that people are capable of understanding really quite subtle things in terms of graphs and numbers and concepts, and want to hear more. They just genuinely want to hear it. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. That the crucial thing is being trustworthy, and people can spot it when you're not, and that we can talk about what that means later on, but I feel that very strongly indeed. And essentially how not to do it, which is to try to manipulate people's emotions, either to frighten them deliberately or reassure them, as so many people were doing, including the government. I think some of the government, maybe not statistics, but in terms of they had deliberately fear-generating advertising, which I think is a total disgrace, and I think counterproductive, but it's really disgraceful. So, and I think the government also, in a way, I think I'm really conscious this had a policy of actually deliberately not talking about some aspects of the pandemic, and in terms of the risks, and so, which annoyed me right from the beginning, which I tried my best, but didn't really succeed. Yeah. So I think it can be done. You get Jonathan Van Tam or Chris Whitty or people like that, they can talk about really quite subtle stuff because they're trusted and they're trustworthy and they understand difficult issues and they can do it. So I really like you do treat the audience with respect. Don't the usual thing, treat them as if they're intelligent, but they don't know anything.
Sorin Petilinat trained as a telecommunications engineer in his native Romania, but for the past 12 years he's been running marketing effectiveness at Mars. Sorin also blogs as the marketing engineer, and he brings his data-driven rigour to everything that he and his team do in measuring the impact of commercial communication. Rather than believe what people say about your products, the Mars approach under Sorin's leadership is based on actual behaviour and attention. He explains more.
And can you tell us about the way that you and your teams make smart and smarter use of data to try and understand the impact of this billion-dollar media and marketing spend?
Certainly. I mean, I could start on very different avenues, I would say, but I'll pick one. From day one in Mars, I observed a positive obsession, I would say, with measurement. We are very conscious of the investments that we make. We're very conscious in how we spend our advertising dollars, and we don't want to waste anything. So we make every decision based on data. We don't trust our guts as probably you would you would put some value to the experience. We don't trust our opinions. We just trust what consumers do, not what consumers say. So behavioral-based research was very, very high on the agenda for Mars, and it is still. And that has guided our various practices. And I'll name one, which is our advertising testing solution. In some instances called pre-testing. We know very well what's available out there from a ad testing solution, and most of the solutions are declarative survey based, and we discarded those immediately. And because we did not find something that would answer our high standards, we've built our own ad testing solution. The solution is called ACE, Agile Creative Expertise. It's purely behavioral. It measures real consumers, real attention, emotions, time in view, and it's linked to sales because we, by employing neurosciences applied to marketing, we found the relationship between attention and emotions and sales, and that's been a journey for the last 4 years now. Actually, I think one of my favorite moments with ACE was the prize we won at ICOM 2 years ago for best use of data. I'm still very, very proud of that. I mean, it's somewhere up there on my library. But I think that's one example of how believing in behavioral data, we built something that's unique to the industry, and we're using that at a large scale.
Also from the world of marketing comes Ian Whittaker, albeit with a very different lens. Ian is a financial analyst specializing in the media and marketing industry, assessing, rating, and projecting the performance of the Big Six ad agency groups, as well as the FANG 5 and their competitors. That's Facebook, now Meta, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. Ian is the founder of Liberty Sky Advisors, and he has been also City AM's Analyst of the Year, not once, but twice. For marketers not to be seen as the old stereotype as the colouring in department, a line memorably deployed by the former Direct Line Group Chief Marketing Officer Mark Evans in our conversation back in Season 1, Ian believes that marketers need to speak the language of the Chief Financial Officer.
What it really comes down to is, what I always say is, if you're trying to... And for advertising, if you think about it for advertisers, people in marketing, it's what you would do with a consumer. If you're trying to sell a product, you've got to understand the consumer. And it's the same sort of thing. And that's really the simple point here, is that when it comes to trying to persuade the CFO, a CEO, and a board that essentially more should be spent on advertising and marketing, what you need to think about is, okay, what are going to be the arguments that persuade them that this is a good investment to make? Yeah, and it is an investment and not a cost. And so what I say is, look, you've got to work out what their priorities are. you've got to find exactly what, so as it were, ticks their boxes, what they're looking for. And then you take what you do and then you say, this is where you can help. Now, I do think one of the things I have been saying and dreading into a lot, and again, people will say, not again, but I think it's an important point. The past 2 years have been a vast unplanned experiment in showing how advertising and marketing plays a direct role in companies' bottom and top line performance. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at the amount of price increases that companies have had to pass through, particularly consumer goods companies, over the past 2 years to consumers, at the start of the period, they would have looked at the scale of price increases and said there's absolutely no way we're going to be able to put that through without our volumes being absolutely decimated. And yet they did. And if you listen to what the companies themselves say on their calls, the number one, by far, the number one answer that comes back, and I would say a vast majority of these companies, is they say it's the strength of their brands that has enabled them to drive through their price increases. And if you are somebody in marketing who wants to persuade your CFO, CEO to spend more on advertising and marketing, that sort of information should be absolute gold dust.
John Hibbs started life as a personal trainer, struggling to scale his business. When a business coach became one of his clients and they bartered services, personal training for business mentoring, John took his first steps on the path to collecting data about people to drive business growth. I'll let him tell the story.
And one of the very first things he got me to do was, and this is so simple, Sam, it's almost ridiculous. He said, measure, from my perspective, how happy or energized my clients are after every session. And I was like, well, I don't even know how to do that. And he said, well, you just, in your diary, you just write down like a smiley emoji or an unhappy emoji, and that's that. So I thought, well, this is a bit silly, but I'll give it a go. And my business model at the time was, you'd either sign up as a new client, you'd either sign up for like one session at 50 quid or something like that, or you'd buy a block of 10 for 450 quid. And nearly everybody bought a block of 10. And then what would happen is either you and I would get on and, you know, it would be great, and you would become a regular client and you buy another block of 10 and another block of 10 and on we go. Or you get to 10 sessions and it wasn't really for you. And, you know, either we hadn't really kind of got on and clicked, which is okay because, you know, it's a very sort of personal relationship experience having a personal trainer. So you can't be everybody's personal trainer. And you'd stop. So in the worst case scenario, I was at least getting 10 sessions out of every client. And so Les said, look, start measuring the energy levels of each session. And then I did that for about 3 months. And then he said, right, well, let's have a look at this. He said, at what point do the clients who eventually stop using you, at what point do they lose their energy? And sort of, you know, you can tell they go off the boil a bit. And so I looked back at all my unhappy emojis and my happy emojis in my diary. And I realized it was always at about session 7 or 8 that clients would kind of go off the boil. And then when it came to the 10th session, they'd say, no, look, it's not really for me. Thank you very much, John. See you later. And so Les said, right, well, what you're going to do now is you're going to create what we're going to call a taster session. And that's how every single, or a taster block, this is how every single client is going to start with you. And so it's a block of 5. It was no cheaper or more expensive. It was exactly the same price, £225 for 5. And lo and behold, when every single client got to the end of 5, their energy levels are still high. They still wanted to do more. And when I said, right, we've got to sign you up and now we're going to move into blocks of 10, everyone said yes. So now, even out of those clients that didn't continue, I was now getting 15 sessions instead of 10. And I thought this, Sam, was the greatest thing ever. I just couldn't believe how clever it was. And so I implemented that into the business, and many other things that we sort of started measuring, engaging, and all this sort of stuff. And very quickly, I mean, really quite quickly, but within sort of 6 months or so, I had sort of too many clients that I could cope with. I had to employ a couple of people, and within a couple of years, I had a really great business. And I was only 25, 26, a really great business. And when I look back now, the overwhelming feeling I had was one of pride. And when I look back at my younger self now, I can think, oh my God, that was amazing. And I wish that for, certainly my children and any youngster really in the world. If you can build something and you can build it really well, and it's just that sense of achievement is amazing.
Today, John runs Coefficient, a software as a service business that helps all sorts of organisations grow by measuring performance from the human, especially staff, point of view. With almost everything about business, from companies to law, from money to ideas, being abstract, just about the only part of it that's real is the people. John explains his philosophy here.
Your focus on people rather than money, rather than companies. Money is an abstract concept. Okay, you have those, but money, I promise to pay the bearer of this piece. Money is abstract. Companies are abstract. Countries are abstract. Law and governance, and the ideas behind companies are abstract. And people, buildings and computers, they're physically real, but people are what's real, and your emphasis on putting energy in finding out what those real, the only real part of a company thinks and feels and wants and fears and the rest of it. That and your phrase, the weird wobbly soups that are businesses, I think it's a wonderful phrase. I'm just kind of picking up on a number. There may be nothing there that you want to respond to, but
no. Well, you're absolutely right. And some of the most important things in our life, like love and friendships and businesses and money, all of these things that we hold, and nations. All these things that we hold really dear to us and get very passionate about don't even exist. Don't exist in the real. It really exists, and so if you want an example of how powerful these kind of like passions and purposes can be, you don't need to look too much further. I gave a talk once to mainly to a bunch of kids, but all their parents were there as well, and everyone in the room was very shocked when I told them that Manchester United didn't really exist. And neither does the game of football in the real sense. It's all just kind of like made up. It's about storytelling and et cetera, et cetera. And if you tie that back into business, we think, the brand of the business is so important, and, it's kind of somehow defines the personality of that organization and what it stands for and what it means and et cetera, et cetera. But of course, we forget that actually without the people creating the brand and living the brand day to day, it's nothing, it's meaningless. So yeah, absolutely. Everything comes back to people.
So, some might wish, some might wish that Man United didn't exist, including perhaps at the time of recording its manager, Erik ten Hag.
Sometimes one of my guests on Data Malarkey will become inquisitor. Here, Soren Pettilen from Mars asks me to set out what I believe are the three most important elements of data storytelling. My guest-turned-interviewer concludes with an excellent example of a culture change at Mars that brings the theory to life in practice perfectly.
You're definitely into something very big here with data storytelling. I don't know. You should answer this, Sam. You're the expert. I'm nowhere near your level of expertise when it comes to storytelling. What would you say are the three most important things?
Well, that's a good question. I like it when my guests turn inquisitor. I think the fundamental skill
in good data storytelling is humanity and empathy, and that might not feel like an obvious answer. It might be mastery of tools and techniques of statistics. But I think that if you don't have a good appreciation of the data tolerance of the audience that you're looking to move to action, be they a board or a marketing community or brand managers or media or whoever it might be, if you don't know what their data tolerance is, if you're unable to know your audience and put yourself into their mind, the mindset, their shoes, and appreciate what the story that you're about to tell, how that's going to come across, then you are bound to fail. Second, I would say, connected to that is the curse of knowledge. Curse of knowledge that a former guest on this podcast, Steve Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, defined in an excellent book called The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. The curse of knowledge, the inability to understand what it's like not to know something that you know. Again, that's a bit of an empathy fail. But those that work with data, those that work with numbers, particularly in the scientific and academic community, but also in businesses too, find it very hard to unknow what they already know, and they assume that other people know that. So I think a failure of empathy, suffering from the curse of knowledge. Those are, I guess, those are two negatives. On the positive front, I would say not showing all your workings out, or rather resisting the temptation, teasing your audience by saying, we've done this piece of research. I'll give you an example. Google have this rule. If you're doing a piece of primary market research or social media listening or something for Google, you're allowed to feed back with 3 slides. And those 3 slides ideally will have no words on them at all. Ideally, there'll be 3 pictures. But if you're going to use words, they can't be less than 30 points. You can only have 3 lines of text on those slides and only 1 data point. You can have an appendix that has infinity slides. But what they want to know is kind of, so what do the data mean now? What should we do as a result? And I think that kind of rule, that kind of discipline, because what you don't want to do is to say, we've done this and this and this, and we ran this cross-tabulation, and we did this ABC test, and down, and none of them showed anything. Your audience is going to go to sleep. But if you say, this is what we looked at, this is what we found, this is what we suggest you do, that's going to get a response. Now, hang on, we've never done that in this category at all. What are you talking about? So I think empathy is the fundamental skill, avoiding the curse of knowledge and being judicious in choosing what statisticians might call the killer statistics, or the most important pieces of data that we should really pay attention to. I don't think, candidly, that either those with data science skills or the data science community have learned that yet. So hopefully there'll be a long and prosperous interaction between me and many global corporates that we work with and my company. But thank you for the question. It kind of
very good answer. And I think the last one resonates very, very highly with me. And I would have answered probably in a similar way. I would have probably focused only on the last one, because I don't have that much experience as you have. But, and I'll tell you a story here. I mean, my first role in Mars was to measure TV effectiveness, as I mentioned, and the effectiveness of TV is measured by sales uplift. And we used to give marketing the percentage of sales uplift that campaign generated, which was, I don't know, 7%, 9%, 12%, 20%. And they had some sort of benchmark, what was good, what was not good. But we immediately realized that we were giving away too much data. And the conversation was focused way too much on the numbers and not on the decision that's needed from them. So we decided to stop sharing sales lift numbers, and we bucketed those sales lift numbers in quartiles, and we gave 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 stars. And we told them very clearly that if you get an ad that has 3 or 4 star, keep going. If you get a 2 star, you better be ready to change it. And if you get a 1 star, remove it immediately, replace it with something older. And out of the entire investment in data to measure campaign effectiveness, the poor marketing employee, the only thing that we're seeing was 1, 2, 3, and 4. That was everything. There's nothing else. But this worked to create a language in the organization. This enabled conversations across markets, across divisions, simple conversations. And it drove the right behaviors, because at the end of the day, what you want with market research is to drive the right behaviors in the organization, and not necessarily just to explain what's happening with a lot of words in the market. So I think we kept the ambiguity of the data, because the data was noisy, and the difference between 7% and 8%, sometimes it was statistically significant, sometimes it was not. And sometimes you should look at that small difference, sometimes you should not. But it's better to keep that ambiguity with the experts, with the marketing research department, and leave marketeers, like the marketing department, to do what they're good at, which is, I don't know, create ads, build amazing products, and use all the knowledge that we can provide to them. So that's an example of simplifying the message, removing the ambiguity, and I would say also removing some emotions, because a lot of conversations were getting very emotional with were like, oh, 8 is better than 7. Oh, you don't like my ad, that's why you don't want me to succeed, and so on. And the moment when you add a layer of simplification, it removes also those emotions.
We began season 5 with one brilliant Cambridge Professor Sir, and so we closed it too, with Simon Baron-Cohen, the Professor of Developmental Psychopathology and Director of the Interdisciplinary Autism Research Centre. Here Simon outlines his empathizing, systemizing theory of autism. I first came across your work when I was doing a Master's in Experimental Psychology at Sussex about 25 years ago, and your book, The Essential Difference. Can you talk to us a little bit about the empathizing, systemizing dimensions and that theory of autism that you developed?
Yeah, because back then, the field of gender differences or sex differences in the mind was mostly focused on, I guess on the one hand, visuospatial skills, which were meant to be sort of stronger in males on average, and then verbal ability, which was meant to be stronger in females on average. But I was sort of coming at the area of gender differences because I was working in the field of autism. We just talked about that. And autism tends to be diagnosed more often in boys than girls. Back then, it was about 4 males for every 1 female. These days, the gap has narrowed a little bit as more girls and women are getting diagnosed, which is very good. But it's still about 3 males to every 1 female. And I was kind of curious as to why were males more likely to end up with a diagnosis of autism. I also kind of wanted to connect what we knew about the profile, the cognitive profile of autistic people, with the field of sex differences or gender differences. And it didn't strike me that, we were looking at the right dimensions. Although language and spatial ability, they are important. I just wondered whether we were missing something. And I'd been looking in autism at social skills, and particularly what's called social cognition. So the ability to understand other people, but also specifically other people's minds. Sometimes it's referred to as theory of mind, being able to imagine what another person is thinking or feeling. And I think that kind of comes under a broader umbrella of empathy. So I kind of looked at the literature on whether there were any gender differences in empathy, and we started looking at that. But the other domain of the mind that we were looking at in autism was what I called systemizing. So systemizing is defined as the ability or the drive to analyze a system, any system, where systems are defined as things that follow rules or patterns. So it's quite an abstract definition, but it would encompass things like mathematics or music or chess, or the weather, or the technology that we're talking through right now, digital systems. And I was looking at these because when we were meeting autistic people, often we were finding, strong interests or even talents in understanding systems, but nevertheless some difficulties or struggles with understanding people, and particularly the mental states of other people, their thoughts and feelings. And so we kind of looked at autism as potentially an extreme of the typical male pattern of development. So irrespective of the gender of the person, we were saying, if you are autistic, is it the case that you may struggle with some aspects of empathy, particularly what's called cognitive empathy, or being able to imagine the thoughts and feelings of another person? But alongside that, might you have an aptitude and an ability to understand systems and patterns in the world? So that's what we kind of set out to study, and we did this by developing some questionnaires. The empathy quotient is one of them, and the systemizing quotient is another. These are self-report questionnaires, so people can just answer how strongly they agree or disagree with a statement about whether they can easily tune into what someone else is thinking or feeling. So that's on the empathy side of things, or whether they have a strong interest in patterns and systems, like how computers work, or as another example, spotting patterns in numbers. And that study that you referred to in 2018, it's come, we're jumping way ahead because the book, The Essential Difference, was published in 2003. But we'll just kind of jump ahead to a big online study, because many of the earlier studies were smaller. And I know your podcast is particularly interested in big data. But the 2018 study, we were able to sort of put those questionnaires up online and get 600,000 non-autistic people to take both questionnaires, and also 36,000 autistic people. And, people can look up the results, but we did find gender differences, quite robust gender differences. We have to be very careful when we talk about these results, because scientists who are listening will know that we're just talking about group averages. But some listeners may sort of mistakenly conclude that we're talking about findings that apply to all women or all men. But they are just, overlapping bell curves in the population. But we found that on average, females scored higher in terms of empathy compared to men. And on average, men scored higher in systemizing compared to women. And when it came to autistic people, they seemed to show an extreme of the typical male pattern. So scoring below average on empathy and above average on systemizing. So I've kind of wrapped all this into a theory. You mentioned it, but it's called the empathizing systemizing theory. And it's simultaneously a new way of looking at gender differences, but also hopefully a helpful way to understand autistic people, that they have a different kind of mind. And actually, I think it's very compatible with what we call neurodiversity these days. That minds are different in the population. We can only really look at group averages, but autism seems to represent one of those styles, cognitive styles, and other kinds of groups in the population, like the genders, but not limited to that, also show different profiles when you have big data.
I always ask my guests to talk about the biggest abuses of data that they've witnessed in their career. Few come bigger or more egregious than that of the disgraced former medic Andrew Wakefield and the MMR scandal. Tellingly, Simon maintains that some good came out of it.
You mentioned the MMR scandal early in this conversation, and I still remember that. And certainly I think it did set back our field of autism research, probably for about 10 years. And it was based on quite a small sample. Andrew Wakefield publishing in The Lancet, a relatively small scale study, that children who'd received the MMR vaccine, often seemed to develop signs of autism very soon after the vaccination. And that caused a kind of public panic amongst lots of parents not to vaccinate their child. But also it set the field off into a direction where they then had to either prove or disprove this theory that the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, was causing autism. And it took about 10 years to disprove it, and a lot of money. But it turned out to be, I suppose you could argue that in some areas of science, you do need to go down a particular road to falsify a hypothesis, not just to confirm it. But there, it led to studies, for example, looking at large populations where half the population had been vaccinated and half hadn't, in places like Denmark and Japan, and comparing autism rates across the two halves of the population and actually finding no difference. So it sort of disproved the theory using big data, but it takes time to disprove it. And along the way, lots of parents had stopped vaccinating their children, and as a result, the rates of measles went up quite dangerously high. So it was at some cost.
I live and work from the People's Republic of Lewis, East Sussex, just near Brighton, and there are many things I like about this place. And one of the I was living here in the wake of that scandal and feeling hugely frustrated at maybe particularly the BBC, but the need for balance, to have editorial balance of somebody who had an opinion and a belief versus science. And I'm sure you were involved in many of those frustrating debates. But of course, in Lewis and Brighton, there was this dip below herd immunity. There was this rush away from vaccine, and some very serious cases of measles. And I know that there were some deaths as well. So I absolutely feel that. I mean, I mentioned in the introduction, I mentioned Centre About Science being set up in the wake of that, and I think they've done some really interesting work. When we had Tracy on, she was talking about the All Trials campaign, which I think is another campaign that you talk about, kind of academic journals improving. And I wasn't aware, actually. It's a while since I've been publishing academic papers, but I wasn't aware that many journals are now saying you need to have a replication cohort. I think that is a net positive, even if it's come out of some bad science that's been published before.
Yeah, and I think particularly in the field of human genetics, we're seeing journals have that as a prerequisite, just because there were too many decades where findings weren't replicating. So, the editors are taking a kind of sensible and cautious approach and asking the authors, the scientists, the researchers themselves, let's see if you can replicate your own work in, an independent sample.
We'll stay in Cambridge and close the episode as we started it, with David Spiegelhalter discussing his motivation to drive public understanding of statistics, evidence, risk and uncertainty in the age of misinformation. Can you tell me what's motivated you to drive public understanding of statistics, and particularly evidence and risk and uncertainty around risk, throughout your career?
Yeah, I suppose I started off really approaching this from a mathematical perspective. I did do maths, and I got interested in probability and statistics and started working in that. But I've always been, and I always have an interest in the abstract methodology. You can get me going on the meaning of probability and Bayesian statistics, and I would just wind me up and off I'll go for hours. And, I wrote papers and, big highly cited technical papers and all this kind of stuff. So I've done all that. But I suppose I've always, even right at the beginning when I was doing that, so like to try to explain it to people. And when scientists and everything talk to me about, how do I start doing what kind of thing that you ended up doing? I say, well, first of all, just practice giving good talks. Just, every academic talk is a performance, and think of it like that, and train for it like that, and look at what other people do. If you're interested in communication, then communicate. Even if it's only to your colleagues, try to do it as well as possible. As we'll get on to, the storytelling, how do you construct a narrative around the argument that you're trying to make? And, using words and using images in particular, using maths sometimes, to what extent does that help or hinder? These are really important issues. And I found myself getting just very interested in that, in a sense, performative aspect of the whole subject. And so when I got a chance to move into a job that was a communication job, a public understanding of risk job, one of these nice jobs that get philanthropically funded. We're very lucky in the UK that we've got a whole series of professors for public understanding of science and philosophy and risk and psychology and all these great jobs that have been funded for people like me who kind of got a bit fed up with doing the research bit and would like to perform. And I do feel strongly about it. Again, I wind me up and off I go about the importance of statistics in life and the numbers and data and uncertainty. And like I think many of my colleagues, our main motivation is anger. We just get so angry, or genuinely emotionally angry at people misusing, making wrong claims on the basis of numbers, misusing evidence, overclaiming their confidence in something based on shabby evidence. And I would get genuinely, this is a real emotional feeling of I'm so angry, I cannot deal with this. I get so angry. So you have to be very careful on social media not to immediately start abusing people and things. So I have learned to sort of hold back a bit. But in an age of misinformation, everything more and more, a lot of it is based on data and misusing numbers. Some of it isn't. Some of it's just based on fake pictures and just claims about what happened. But a lot of it is there's a lot of data misinformation around, and not always is misinformation. Quite often unconscious, people just looking at something and drawing the wrong conclusion and making some grand claim. And so I do think it's important in modern life, and it's kind of think was the only thing I can do. It's what I do know a bit about is the limitations of what evidence can say, what you can say on the basis of evidence. And that's really what and other statisticians and everything, that's our expertise.
So there we have it. Season 5 is a wrap. We're taking a 6-week summer break now, and we'll be back with Season 6 on Wednesday the 11th of September. The upcoming season offers another eclectic group of guests from an ever more diverse set of professions. We'll be hearing from women and men at the top of their game from the worlds of publishing, consumer goods, political punditry in the wake of the UK general election, journalism, neuroscience, and numeracy. As usual, their common approaches to using data smarter have lessons for us all. We start with Ilan Shem, who is both Vice President of Corporate Responsibility for Elsevier, the world's leading scientific publisher and data analytics company, and Director of the Elsevier Foundation. It's a great episode, and a brilliant example of how data is being used to bring about positive change for diversity, ethics, and inclusion. I can't wait to share it with you. As ever, any suggestions for guests? If you think you'd make a good guest, or you know or work with someone who'd tell a great story about how they make smarter use of data, do drop us an email at hello@usingdatasmarter.com, or complete the application form at https://www.usingdatasmarter.com/guests. I look forward to welcoming you back for more data-driven common sense soon, with the Data Malarkey podcast dropping every other Wednesday on Apple, Spotify and YouTube Music, and video episodes going live a week later on our YouTube channel at Data Malarkey. Thank you so much for listening. Do like, subscribe, share, rate, with 5 stars naturally, on your favourite podcast platform. The first 5 seasons have been an absolute joy to research, create and publish. It feels like we're really starting to hit our stride.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.